Talks between the U.S. and Russia have so far met the low expectations set by both nations. Both sides say little progress was made in defusing the situation in Europe. The U.S. and NATO allies are concerned a buildup of Russian troops near Ukraine signals Russia is preparing to invade, which Russia denies. The talks mostly centered around Russia demanding Ukraine, Georgia, and other former Soviet nations be excluded from joining NATO. The U.S. says that is a non-starter. Talks between Russia and the U.S. continue tomorrow in Brussels, with other NATO countries joining in. For more on this, I want to bring in Elise Labott. She is a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine and the founder and CEO of Zivvy, an online platform that discusses global issues. And full disclosure, Elise and I were once colleagues at another network. Elise, it's really good to have the chance to talk to you again. Welcome.
It's so great to be with you again. It's so great to be with you again, Elaine. Really.
You know, so seeing you, Elise, reminds me, when I was covering the White House, you were covering the State Department many years ago for another network. At that time, this is during the George W. Bush administration into the Obama administration, a central figure, one of the central figures when it came to U.S. foreign policy was Vladimir Putin. So we're going to talk specifics of this moment, but right now I just want to kind of get your thoughts. How central a figure to what's happening today is Vladimir Putin and his view of how Russia should be perceived on the world stage?
Well, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Elaine. I think his view is critical. I mean, as you mentioned, he's been this critical player all along. There was a period where Dmitry Medvedev kind of took over as the quote unquote leader of Russia, but it was still Putin behind the scenes. And his view that Russia kind of has lost its, Mother Russia kind of stance in the world and trying to maintain this, sphere of influence and regain these old kind of glory days of Russia, I think really is what's central here, and plays into this fight with the U.S. and in a larger sense, NATO. And by and large, he does have Russian support. I mean, clearly there are problems with his rule and the way he's dealt with the economy and also, obviously oppressed his political opponents. But when it comes to asserting Russia on the world stage, I'd say by and large, he has a lot of public support for this idea that Russia is still a great power.
So fast forward to today, and with all of that in mind, one of the major sticking points is Russia's demand that Ukraine and other former Soviet nations not be able to join NATO. That's something the U.S. is firmly opposed to. Is there any middle ground on this, Elise?
I don't think so. I mean, look, Russia not only said that Ukraine could, and the others could never join NATO, but never, 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 ever join NATO. And I mean, look, the U.S. and NATO say that NATO is a defensive organization. It's not, designed to be offensive against Russia. But from Russia's point of view, if you see, NATO continuing to expand to countries that were once its influence, I mean, you may not be able to justify it, but at least you can see where they're coming from. What NATO is saying and what the U.S. is saying is they're not going to make decisions for these countries. The new mantra is nothing about you without you in terms of Ukraine. And what the U.S. and NATO are saying is Russia will make those decisions. Ukraine and other countries will make their decisions on whether to join NATO, not Russia. That being said, although Ukraine has been given, kind of permission, if you will, or acceptance to join NATO, it's not joining NATO so fast. Ukraine has a lot of its own problems internally that would make it, difficult for NATO to move ahead with full ascension to membership. So some of this on Russia is just kind of, a kind of line in the sand saying they don't want Ukraine or any country to join. It's not happening so fast. And don't forget, Russia, about a month ago, published this proposal for agreements with the U.S. and NATO that would not only roll back Western military activity in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, obviously also establishing what we were talking about, this sphere of Russian influence in areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union. The U.S. is saying, that's a non-starter. You're not entitled to this sphere of influence. And, Russia would say, well, neither are you.
So the U.S. says there is possible agreement, Elise, on the placement of U.S. and Russian missile systems. What might that deal entail?
Well, I mean, what they're talking about is really, they're not willing to discuss troop deployments or force posture, but they could revive the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. If you remember, President Trump's administration withdrew from that treaty because they felt that Russia was violating the terms. But, there could be reciprocal restrictions on the size and scope of exercises, the size and scope of strategic bombers close to each other's territory, deploying some, taking away some of those strategic missiles that really are in Russia's backyard that they say they feel threatened by. I don't necessarily think they're a threat to Russia, given Russia's, missile and nuclear arsenal. But, to say that they're in their backyard is true. And there would be a kind of reciprocal pulling back if they were to re-enter those treaties. So that, they're not really talking about actual missiles or actual bombers right now. But those talks could go ahead. Obviously, that'll be on the agenda tomorrow when the U.S.-Russia-NATO Council meet. The U.S.-NATO-Russia Council meets, which is basically all of NATO with Russia talking about some of these larger regional issues.
Yeah, what more can we expect, at least, from those talks tomorrow?
Well, I mean, by and large, I think NATO really wants to de-escalate this issue with Russia and Ukraine. And if they can start talking about, some of these larger irritants in the relationship, the missiles in particular, maybe a reciprocal agreement on exercises where the U.S. is not going to have large-scale exercises right in Russia's backyard, and Russia is not going to have these snap exercises in Ukraine that are huge, a little bit more predictability in the relationship. That could be on the agenda. They could kind of set these talks for larger issues about strategic redeployments. I think right now everything is about Ukraine, and what the U.S. is saying. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who led the U.S. delegation, is saying, Russia has 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. Until those troops kind of go back to their barracks and you calm down the situation, it's a little bit hard to have this larger discussion.
Elise, as you well know, often with geopolitics, economic issues are very much intertwined, I guess is the best way to say it. And Germany, which is home to Europe's largest economy, seems to have a less adversarial relationship with Russia than other NATO countries. And the Germans have expressed dismay about Russian troops along its shared border with Ukraine, but seem hesitant to cut economic ties with Moscow. So tell us how gas pipelines factor into this standoff.
Well, as you said, Russia, out of all of the countries, has the largest kind of economic stake. And particularly that's the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline, which would go from Russia to Germany, kind of, bypassing Ukraine, which has really been a source of European natural gas. And traditionally, if you look at the U.S. kind of trying to bow to Russia, give Russia a little bit more leeway. They haven't sanctioned Russia on that, even though the U.S. is adamantly opposed to it. It was really going to go ahead anyway. But now that you see what's going on with Ukraine, the Germans are saying, listen, we're warning you that you're going to face harsher sanctions in the event of any military aggression against Ukraine. And that could prompt us to rethink cooperation with Moscow. You had Angela Merkel, the longtime German chancellor of Germany, that, had a larger kind of strategic vision for Russia and Germany, and economics obviously played into that. And she had a better relationship, not a good relationship, but a better relationship with Vladimir Putin than any of the other European countries. And she's gone now. And so you could, I think what the Germans are saying is, don't push us. We will rethink this Nord Stream pipeline. And you don't have Angela Merkel in your pocket to kind of calm things down anymore. So I think it'll really depend on how serious the Germans are and how willing the Russians are to tempt them. I mean, Ukraine is really a red line for Russia, but at the same time, I don't think they want a full-out military confrontation with NATO, and particularly with the U.S. And so I think they're testing the waters, and I think they're going to go as far as maybe they can. And then I don't think we'll see a full-on military invasion by Russia of Ukraine, but they're going to continue to push the U.S. and NATO until they get a little bit more assurances of some of these larger strategic kind of redeployments and things like that.
All right, Elise Labott. Elise, it is wonderful to see you and have a chance to pick your brain about all things foreign policy again. It's been a really long time. Thanks, Elise.
Yes, you bet.